So you are now a graduate of step 11, and that was a pretty in-depth part 1 and part 2. So what I want to do is kind of go a little bit more into detail around the difference between adjusting and increasing your exposure that's from your camera versus increasing your light intensity. This can kind of be a little bit difficult to understand the difference between the two. The overview is that when you increase the exposure in your light, so if I decrease the exposure, everything in the image comes down in brightness. Me, my foreground, meaning what's in front of me, my background, what's behind me. Now if we increase that exposure from the camera, now I'm exposed, but I also brighten up the background, I brighten up the foreground. So when you increase and decrease that in camera, you can't selectively change the exposure of specific things in the frame. Now when it comes to changing the light intensity, meaning this bad boy right here, it's gonna be able to increase and decrease the brightness of selective parts of the image because I'm closer to it. And because the background is further away and the background is actually darker, it's not gonna reflect as much light. You can only see me right now because the light that's hitting me is bouncing off me and hitting you. So because of my skin tone, what I'm wearing, I'm closer to the light, I'm brighter because I'm bouncing more light to you, which is kind of crazy, right? So the darker background is darker because the black paint is not bouncing as much light. Black is black because it reflects hardly anything. So to kind of further, to explain this, what I want to do is take this camera and let's move this out of the way because we're gonna do a little experiment. Okay. Oh, jeez. Okay. Yeah. Okay. There we go. So we have our camera. And the exposure is actually not too bad on our camera right here. It's actually pretty well exposed by our light. Now, if I were to change the intensity of our lighting source, let's pay attention to the exposure on the camera, and let's pay attention to the exposure in the background. So I'm gonna turn this down. And you can see that now my camera is really dark, really dark. The background, it did come down, but it wasn't a massive change if we look at the before and the after. So if I want to fix this and I wanted to bring up the exposure because I was setting the settings on my camera, I said, well, me or the camera, whatever it is really dark in the image. So yeah, I have my light over here, but I'm gonna try to fix this by turning up the exposure in camera. So let's do that. Let's turn the exposure up in camera. And we did that by increasing the ISO and by decreasing the shutter speed, which is allowing more light into the camera, and then the ISO is boosting the light that's in the camera. Now you can see we have, this is brighter, but then the background is also brighter too. It pushed up everything together and it looks okay, but if we bring that back down, this is our actual exposure in this actual situation. So now again, let's look at the exposure on our camera, which is really close to the light, and our background. The background is farther away from the light, so it's not gonna be as affected as much and brightened as much, but this is really close to our light. So if this works, when I brighten this up, the exposure on our camera, boom, is gonna be really good. And the background will have brightened up a little bit, but it's a completely different effect of adjusting the light exposure versus adjusting the camera exposure. For this kind of scenario, when we want to brighten our foreground and leave our background darker, it's perfect because we want us, the subject, to have the perfect amount of exposure and lighting, and we want the background behind us to be a little bit less lit so that our image has more depth, looks more cinematic, and overall has a more professional feeling. So I hope that that little science experiment gives you a lot more clarity on the difference between adjusting your light source versus adjusting the lighting settings for exposure in your camera.